Sheila, you might want to call on people because I think everyone's afraid of interrupting the other.
Sorry.
Oh, that's always a struggle in our new virtual world. So is there anyone from Sempra?
Yes, sorry about that. I think I was muted. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Baker. I'm the Enterprise Risk Manager representing SoCalGas and SDG&E today. I'm joined by my colleagues Josh Stewart and Mason Withers as well, who will be available to answer questions too.
Thank you. Would a representative from TURN like to introduce themselves?
Yeah, this is Katie Morsoni, and today I am joined by Dr. Charles Feinstein and Dr. Jonathan Lesser. I will be doing the majority of the speaking, but Chuck and Jonathan will back me up as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Would anyone from Protect Our Communities Foundation like to introduce themselves?
Yeah, hi, this is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities. Thanks.
Thank you. How about anyone from Cal Advocates?
Thank you, Sheila. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Parks from Cal Advocates, and I'm joined by Miles Gordon and Tess Medeiros.
Thank you, Chris. How about anyone from MGRA?
Joseph Mitchell from MGRA.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Is there any other organization that would like to introduce themselves before we continue?
Hi, good morning. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
All right, thank you. Good morning. My name is Andrew Graff. I'm here on behalf of Coalition of California Utility Employees. Good morning.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Dr. Eric Wojcik, you can. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? All right, not hearing anyone. So we are, before we get started, I would like to note that this event will be recorded, and we have two IT support staff with us, Brevin Fong and George DeCampo. So if you have any issues on the IT side, please message them, or if any of your colleagues are having trouble joining. So we are here today at this technical working group meeting to address the foundational elements issue in the phase 1 track 1 of the R.20-07-013. To start our technical working group meeting, we will have a joint utility proposal and presentation from the utilities. Then we will follow with a presentation with a counter proposal from Cal Advocates. And then we'll open it up for general discussion so that other technical working group members will have an opportunity to respond to the proposals and ask questions from the presenters. To set the scope of today's meeting, the presentations and proposals and questions will be centered around what activities could or should be included as foundational elements in the RDF. What should the cost threshold be for including foundational mitigations in the RDF and RSE calculations? And how should those foundational costs be apportioned in the RDF? So before we jump into the joint utility presentation, does anyone have any questions? Hearing none. George, would you be able to pull up the utilities presentation, please? And I will hand it over to the utilities.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. This is Chris Baker. Thank you for the opportunity for allowing the joint IOUs to express our position for the treatment of foundational elements in the risk-based decision framework. Over the past few weeks, the IOUs collaborated and put a great effort into better understanding the alignments and divergences of the proposed foundational activities definition, the proper use of allocation, and lastly, the methods available for application of the threshold test. This presentation will be split and covered by each utility for about a third of the duration of the presentation. I'll be providing the overview and definition of foundational activities, followed by Chris Bejas to discuss the threshold test, and Vincent to drive it to completion, showcasing the potential use of portfolio RSCs for the programs that pass the threshold test. We kindly ask that during this collaborative session that we let the utilities finish their few slides that they're presenting on, and before diving into questions. We will be providing gaps in the presentations to allow for questions to be addressed. Next slide. So starting with the overview, on June 22nd, staff hosted a technical working group to discuss two topics related to foundational activities. The first was whether foundational costs should be subject to a threshold test, and if so, what should the threshold test be? Should the threshold test apply to each foundational activity cost individually, or aggregated for all of the foundational activities associated with the same risk? The second question, how foundational costs should be apportioned to the mitigations. During the technical working group and post-written comments, members requested additional information from the IOUs regarding a list of foundational activities and programs. The IOUs met several times after to discuss the joint proposal and examine the type of activities that would deem to be foundational. Next, the IOUs positions were provided during the technical working group on July 22nd, which are also in this presentation. Next slide. Lastly, the definition of foundational elements. It appears that there was no disagreement on staff's definition, and the IOUs agree with the definition below of foundational activities. The definition is as follows: foundational programs and/or activities are initiatives that support multiple mitigation programs but do not directly reduce the consequences or reduce the likelihood of risk events. The joint IOUs do not believe that a formal list of foundational activities needs to be provided or approved or agreed upon by all parties, nor do we believe it would be productive to try to do so. The utilities have varying types of foundational activities depending on their proposed risks and mitigation programs included in their respective ramp filings. There must be some reasonable level of discretion in this process, with the utility possessing the ability to make updates to foundational activities as new operational needs or circumstances arise, without having to obtain any type of approval to do so. The IOUs can provide a list of foundational activities and costs in our ramp reports, and parties can provide their feedback and ask data requests at the appropriate juncture regarding how these costs were treated in the risk decision framework in terms of risk spending efficiency and RSC calculations. This concludes the overview and definition provided by SoCalGas and SDG&E, and I'll open up questions and turn it over to Chris to continue with the rest of the presentation afterwards. Thank you. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Thanks very much. And good morning, everyone. Good to see everybody, and thanks for joining for this. Going to turn now to the slide, and I'm going to try to announce the title of each slide for those that might be listening on audio only. The slide now is titled Threshold Test. To summarize first, the IOUs are in general agreement that if the sum of all foundational activities that supports mitigations would exceed a predefined threshold, that's yet to be determined, then the IOUs should attempt to allocate the costs or provide RSCs for foundational activities through a portfolio. Now, what do we mean by the sum here? That means the sum, for purposes of the IOUs discussion, it means the sum of all of the related foundational activities that are supporting a set of mitigations that if it exceeds a predefined threshold. And then in that case, the IOU should attempt to allocate the costs or provide RSCs for the foundational activities, perhaps through a portfolio analysis. Now, just again to clarify, related. Foundational programs in the IOU's view, foundational programs are related and belong in a group if they have at least one mitigation in common with another member of the group. Okay, and the IOUs are open to discussions regarding what would be an appropriate and useful threshold limit. As I mentioned earlier, that has yet to be defined in this proceeding. We think the threshold could take the form of either a set dollar amount or potentially could be measured as a percentage of the mitigation costs that the foundational activities support. If the staff, the ALJ, and the parties believe that a stated threshold is needed now, then we think we need to turn to an objective measurement. And this is a subject that has been covered in prior written comments by SCE at least, where we recommend that if we must have a measure now, we recommend using the R.28 backstop amounts from the SMAP settlement agreement. Again, that's objective. It was commission endorsed, and it can be considered further refined by staff and parties in future risk-related proceedings like future SMAP proceedings. The bottom of the slide here lists the amounts. This is also contained in the joint IOU written proposal that Shayla circulated along with the deck. May we have, oh, and one important clarification. When we look at these numbers, you'll see a footnote at the bottom. These numbers are based on a 3-year cycle, and that 3-year cycle is what was contemplated in the SMAP settlement agreement. The capital dollar amounts, though, may need to be updated to a different amount, perhaps $100 million over 4 years, to reflect moving to a 4-year rate case cycle. And also, just to clarify, these amounts here are in millions of dollars. Next slide, please. All right, now we're talking about treatment in the RDF. That's this slide subject. And we mean treatment of how do you treat for purposes of, let's say, RSE calculations. What's the methodology that would be used? And we believe strongly that no unilateral or arbitrary treatment should be imposed. And for purposes of the discussion, when we say treatment, it could be any cost allocation methodology, dictating a portfolio analysis, or it could be any still to be identified methodology for incorporating foundational costs in the RSE calculations. Now, each IOU should have the ability to determine the specific treatment methodology because each IOU may have particular risk analyses that it needs to perform in its ramp, and it needs to make sure that the risk analyses clearly and concisely translate to the IOU's GRC application that will occur 1 year later. The Commission has in GRC proceedings, such as SCE's pending GRC, emphasized that ramp to GRC translation and how it needs to be very concise, clear, and easy to understand and analyze for the Commission and for the parties. So we believe that there has to be some flexibility on the ramp end so that you get that clear translation to the GRC application that utility will be filing. And also just a note, we're using the wildfire mitigation plans as an example that a methodology chosen has to be consistent with guidance or requirements in other CPUC landscapes, such as, for example, the WMPs, because we should minimize differences as feasible between modeling and reporting in different forums if we're doing the same type of analysis. Next slide, please. We do have concerns that if we adopt and dictate, if a treatment is adopted in a dictatorial fashion, it could significantly distort or skew the RSEs to the point where they may no longer provide the value that they otherwise would to parties. For example, if there's a non-vetted methodology adopted, then let's say the IOU realizes that there is a different methodology that would be more appropriate for the IOU's showing, that would make it more clear, more transparent, and more understandable, and more useful. Then that would result in additional burdens to both the IOUs and to the parties and to the Commission, because the IOU may be obliged to provide an entire other set of RSEs using the more useful methodology, the more appropriate and tailored methodology. And this, we feel, would complicate what is already a very extensive and technical process when the utility develops, refines, and finalizes its ramp and tries to assist the parties and the Commission in their review and analysis of the ramp. This is technical stuff, and there needs to be some flexibility in making sure it's presented in the most effective, understandable, and concise way for the reader, whether that be a Commission reader or a party reader. And we also would just note that a further complication, and one that the parties here have not addressed to date is how any methodology would be incorporated at the tranche level, since under the SMAP settlement agreement provisions, tranching is a required element. I'll take questions if there are any at this time. And of course, we can also have further discussion at the more general discussion in Q&A.
This is Katie. I had a quick question. You referred to there being variation in the risk analyses. Shouldn't the risk analysis all be driven by the SMAP settlement? So I guess I'm just questioning what variation the utilities are referring to here. And then I have another question, but I guess if we could answer that one first.
Do you mean, Katie, like variations when we're talking about that the utilities need a little bit of flexibility so that they can make sure we get a clear and concise translation to the GRC? Is that what you're referring to? Okay.
Yeah.
Good question. Appreciate it. And I think I speak for all the utilities that, of course, we will comply with the provisions, the negotiated and commission endorsed provisions of the SMAP settlement agreement. But for example, if you look at the utility ramps, there are certain nuances in each ramp showing, because each utility treats certain risks differently. Each utility may identify certain risks or characterize them or even group risks differently. And it's hard to be very specific. It's more the idea, Katie, because, and the reason I say it's harder for me to be specific is because we have yet to file a ramp under the SMAP settlement provisions. But for example, we might have different scaling functions. We might have different risk attributes. We might have different risk consequences. And so all of this means that the utility should be able to present it in the way the utility thinks is best and be held answerable to the parties and to the commission for what the utility has provided. Frankly, the utility should not be able to fall back on saying, well, this wasn't the way I would have done it otherwise, but we had this dictated methodology, and so I did it. Not my fault that it's flawed. We don't want that kind of thing in ramp, Katie, and I think everyone would agree with that. So that's really what I'm talking about. And again, I think I've tried to give you some specifics, but I'll be better able to give you even more specifics after we have prepared and finalized our ramp showing under the SMAP settlement provisions.
Okay. And then my second question was on this slide that's showing right now, you refer to a non-vetted methodology. What do you mean by non-vetted? Do you mean it hasn't gone through a ramp yet, or do you mean it hasn't been test driven? I just want to understand your definition of that.
That it hasn't been test driven, and I think that's a good way to put it, is, like what we've seen in certain discussion points in this proceeding is parties saying, for example, well, maybe we try out a certain methodology or pathway. We'll try it out, let's say in SCE's now pending ramp, and we'll see if it works or not. That we feel is not really the way to go, because what you need to do is, I like your phrasing, you test drive it, you see if it works, and then you decide whether it will be stamped into an actual ramp showing, where if it turns out that it is not a suitable one, then the utility is left holding the bag, the commission in a sense is left holding the bag, and the parties are left holding the bag, because everyone is working with a product that is less useful than it would be. And I would note that, for example, Katie, as you well know, in the case of something related, the rate case plan, the commission doesn't test drive things to see if they work or not. They periodically, let's say every several years, revisit the rate case plan, and there is a proceeding where an evidentiary record and other record is built on what changes are needed and why. Then the commission decides on those changes. They don't do it by saying, for example, we're not sure if this works or not. Let's just have PG&E do it in their next rate case and see if it works or not. They don't test drive it that way. They test drive it by building a record in the rate case plan proceeding. And given that the ramp is effectively just a part of the GRC application process, it has its own independent function, of course, but it is a precursor to the GRC submission. We think that the treatment should be similar, that you don't just use an actual proceeding showing as the test drive. You have to test drive and validate it separately from that, particularly if a party such as SCE is already well underway in its preparation.
So you would consider this technical working group sessions discussing this issue, working this issue out, and then potentially testing its impact as an appropriate vetting of a process?
I think a process separate from the actual, and I'll speak for SE, a process separate from our actual now in progress ramp development and refinement is what should be used, not the actual ramp itself. And in terms of the technical working group, it depends on what the test driving would be. I think that this forum may be a very good one, but it would depend on what is the actual method of test driving. Again, I'll defer back to an objective measure, which was what the commission does with the rate case plan, where they build a record, they take evidence, they take inputs, and then they decide. However we do it, that kind of process, but separate and apart from trying to test drive it using, say, SCE's ramp showing as the guinea pig to see if something works or not. Because at that point, if it doesn't work, you're stuck with a showing that is not as effective as it would have been, not as clear or understandable, and quite likely not as useful if, for example, the wrong threshold is chosen or some other similar methodology, particularly something that feeds into RSEs.
Understood.
Thanks, Katie. Those are great questions. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Chris. Hafizer Chowdhury with Rasa Team. Just for further clarification on Katie's question, if your non-vetted methodology become adopted, would it change whatever the calculation you folks have done for RSE and would change the methodology further down the road, or is that my understanding correct or no?
Well, I do think that if a non-vetted methodology is adopted, then if it's adopted, presumably the utility would have to follow it. If it is adopted in a fashion where it is not one that is for consideration, but one that is dictated in the same way that, for example, the rate case plan has certain requirements or commission decisions have certain requirements for the ramp. I think it would possibly, depending on what the methodology is, it could considerably change the utilities calculation, what feeds into RSE calculations, what data, what thresholds, et cetera.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate your question.
Hi, Chris. Eric Wojciech with UCAN. I gotta say, I'm a little pushed back by this proposal. It seems a bit sketchy. One of the things that's bothering me is it says things like the foundational element costs will be part of the risk spend efficiency under certain conditions, and that we have to submit a data request to ask you how that's going to happen. So that's just one thing. That you don't want, no unilateral or arbitrary treatment should be imposed, but yet you seem to be imposing a unilateral treatment and saying, hey, utilities should be able to say what they want to do, and yet it's a one-way constraint. No commission or stakeholder terms can be considered. So there's some tone things in here that really, I think, make me just really not comfortable, unhappy, feel like you want to have it entirely one way, and you're dictating the terms. So if you want to get into the details about this, we can. I don't know that that's going to be productive right now.
All right. Well, I appreciate your thoughts. I would say, as to the first part of your question, I don't think that's what we said, and I don't think this is the place to get into a debate about that, but I don't believe that that's
what your presentation says.
Again, I don't think this is the place to get into that. As to the second part of your comment, I don't believe we're dictating anything. The utility has the burden of proof in the ramps. We follow commission requirements, and when you said party inputs, so the idea is the utility should not structure its ramp showing around party preferences. The utility should structure it around commission requirements and what the utility feels, which has the burden of proof, what will be the most useful, effective, and concise showing, and the most transparent showing. And the parties have the full right to comment, criticize, tell the commission what should be done with the utilities ramp showing, et cetera. But the process, Eric, with all due respect, is not for parties to say, this is how I want your ramp showing to go, because each party has its own independent interest and perspective on that. The process is for the commission, our regulator, our collective regulator, to tell us how it should go based on what the commission thinks is best. And I would note that the decisions where the commission set up this framework did give the utilities latitude to color within the lines in the way the utility thinks would present the best showing. That's similar to what happens in general rate cases. That's similar to what happens in other large and complex endeavors.
Okay, there's two different pieces of this. Right now, we're doing a workshop to try to get some agreement on elements. The ramp is almost a separate piece. And so I just want to make sure that here in this process, you're not saying, stand back, stand down, let us determine the conditions. And we'll tell you in data requests what you think is, we think is how we're going to do this in the ramp process. So you can't have it both ways.
I don't think that's what we're doing, and I respectfully, again, I don't think this is the place to have the debate. I fundamentally disagree with certain aspects of what you're saying, and I'm happy to take it offline with you if you wish.
Hi, Chris. This is Chris Parks at Cal Advocates. I think time is short, but I just, on this slide that you have up, maybe I could just mention or ask to compute RSEs, if the utilities say allocate it in one fashion, and then they were to allocate it in a different fashion in terms of cost, then I guess that would drive a different set of RSEs, right? The RSE, if numbers are put in some kind of category versus another allocation, then it is going to be a different set of RSEs. Is that fair to say?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. And if
one
of the other utilities does, please feel free to jump in, because I'm not quite clear on Chris's question.
Okay, well, I don't want to, I know
Chris,
that, go ahead.
Sorry, Chris, this is Mason with SDG&E. I think you're right that if there are different ways that allocations could be done, and if you do them different ways, you would get different RSEs. So I think that was your question.
Yeah, and so basically I was wondering then, you're worried about distorting or skew RSEs to the point that they may not provide value, but I'm wondering that would just be sort of like a number crunching thing. That wouldn't be necessarily a large undertaking, would it? To, okay, under this allocation, we come up with this set of RSEs. Under this allocation, we come up with a different one. And then we could actually have the data to determine if for some reason it does appear that something being skewed by some allocation of costs versus how it gets parsed against the different mitigation programs. But anyway, I don't want to hold up the meeting because I know time is short, but and I think there's time at the end to maybe ask more about that. So.
Okay. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over now to PG&E for the concluding slides in the program. So in the utility joint IOUs part of the program. So Vince, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. So good morning, everyone. It's good to see everybody here at the TWG. I would like to run through PG&E's portfolio approach to calculating RSEs for foundational items. So once again, under the joint IOU proposal, for RSE treatment, we are advocating that IOUs either have the flexibility to use an allocation scheme that aligns to the particular risk analysis that the IOU performs in its ramp or GRC, or alternatively use this approach in front of you. On this slide, we have an example of foundational programs. They're F1 and F2, and the mitigations they support, M1, M2, M3. So once again, setting some context, F1 and F2 are foundational programs. They meet the definition, and they in some total are above threshold. However, the thresholds are defined. So we're coming down to the step where we determine we want the RSEs. We want RSEs to include the cost of the foundational programs. Right? F1 could be some examples of foundational programs. Some F1 could be enhanced modeling software, cameras, etc. M1 and M2 could represent wildfire mitigations. So in this example, you see F1 and F2 are supporting M1 and M2 and M3. So first of all, I want to make clear that if we're unable to break down the foundational cost further, and then basically what we're saying, we'll use this approach to come up with RSEs instead of using an arbitrary allocation scheme, right? So once again, if we're not able to break down the foundational cost further. So starting off here, what we want to bring across is that we want to propose leaving the RSEs of M1, M2 as is. That is, the RSE of M1 is the risk reduction of M1 divided by the cost of M1. Same with M2, so on and so forth. So the cost of the foundational programs then should be captured in these portfolio RSEs, which in this slide is calculated by summing the risk reduction of all the supported programs, M1, M2, M3, divided by the total cost of the mitigations and the foundational programs. So by including the foundational cost in the denominator, it gives a measure of how effective the overall body of work, M1, M2, M3, is taking into account all the costs, not only the mitigation cost, but the foundational cost. Our thought is that this portfolio RSE can be compared to other RSEs to determine whether this body of work in totality is effective. So we've been having some conversation with parties, and there's been interest in looking at alternative portfolios. So here, if you, in this example, for example, what if we decided not to do M3, right? How would that compare? That would change the portfolio, right? So if we decide, oh, we're not going to do M3, that would change the portfolio. And how would that new portfolio compare to the one in front of you, right? So if you look again, once again, in this example, there are 3 mitigations, each of which can be either on or off. They're kind of like binary, right? Proposed, not proposed. So, you know, what that turns out is that there are 8 combinations. And we're amenable to providing a tool whereby parties can explore the 7 other alternatives that are out there to see how they compare with the combination that we chose in our ramp GRC. So turn it over to questions now.
Vincent, this is Joseph Mitchell. Another thing you might consider here with the foundational programs is to possibly for your portfolio or for any other method people would choose, look at the differential RSE effect of a reduction or increase in the foundational programs. So this gives you sort of a sensitivity analysis based on the foundational programs, and it's a fairly simple way to go about it. So say your data center, instead of spending, you know, 5 million on a data center, you're only going to spend 3 million on a data center. What is the effect on what mitigations you can do and so forth for the overall portfolio? Or if you were to increase it to $8 million, what mitigations would you be able to do that you wouldn't be able to do? So that way you get a sort of a view of which of these are really very cost sensitive. That's just a suggestion.
Yeah, I think a good suggestion to be able to, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking about the derivatives. but yeah, I think you would have the information to do that with this proposal. And I suppose if we're building a one-time tool, we can include the derivatives too. Thank you for the suggestion.
This is Katie from Turn. I was hoping that perhaps the other utilities could give any response or reaction that they have to the portfolio approach and the potential tool as proposed by PG&E. I'm going to take silence as acceptance of the methodology.
Hello, hi. This is Chris Baker speaking for SoCalGas and SDG&E. Just one of our concerns that we do have with this approach in terms of if a mitigation which has a high scoring RC is placed into any of the foundational programs, it significantly increases the foundational program's RSC. So we feel like there's a little bit of subjectivity into adding, depending on which mitigations are actually placed into the foundational programs. That's just one
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
But if you aren't considering the cost of the foundational programs that are required in order to implement a mitigation, aren't you artificially inflating the RSE for that mitigation?
I wouldn't necessarily say we would be artificially increasing it. We would be, making sure that we have the proper risk reduction and cost identified for that particular mitigation that goes into the foundational program.
But okay, I'm going to ask another follow-up. I guess when I think of it, I don't think of a mitigation going into the foundational program. I think of a foundational program going into a mitigation, and that you need to have the foundational program in order to implement the mitigation successfully. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, you must include the foundational cost. And so unless you're both considering the individual mitigations, RSC, and the variety of portfolios, I guess, you aren't accurately considering the full risk reduction and the full cost of related programs.
Chris, I'll take that. Hi, Katie. This is Mason. I fully understand what you're talking about. The issue for us, I think, is that the foundational program is not a targeted program at a mitigation. The foundational program might accomplish many, many tasks. You can think of a data center as like in Joe's example, or you can think of it as a vehicle, or there's other things that those foundational programs do. So allocating the entire cost of the foundational program to a mitigation or even a couple mitigations when that's a small fraction of what the foundational program does would be misleading. And so we're trying to struggle, like, how do you allocate which portion of the foundational program would be associated to either an individual mitigation or a collection of mitigations as shown here. It's a very complicated program. A lot of the foundational programs that we're talking about don't necessarily, even a bulk of what they are there for is for mitigation support. They're just general running the business and collecting information. That's part of running our business. So it's a very complicated matter, and we haven't worked out all the details yet. So that's why I said earlier to Chris Park's question, different ways of allocating will get you different RSEs. And I don't think we've completely cracked that nut yet.
I just want to jump in really quick to know we are at time for the joint utilities presentation. So maybe SCE could reply during our general discussion period. I just don't want to take time away from the next presentation, and I know they have one more slide.
Sorry,
I want to jump in with one question. This is Steve Hain from SPD. Question for Vincent. In your proposal pictured here, is M1, M2, and M3 mitigations for the same risk, or could they be for different risks?
Could be for different risks, right? You just go by the definition. It just says multiple mitigations. Doesn't say it has to be from the same risk or whatever. So yeah, it's a cross risk.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you.
Shayla, this is Chris with Edison. Thanks for your thoughts. I appreciate where we are on the schedule, and we'd be happy to, as time permits, to address the earlier question in the general Q&A. We think Mason covered a lot of it already, but if we have anything to add, we'll cover it in the general Q&A.
Thank you. So Vincent, do you want to move on to your last slide, and then we can go on to Calvin's presentation?
let's go on. So once again, this is a recap of our proposal, joint IOU proposal. We do support the development of a threshold test. and that, if the foundational activities are above a certain threshold, utilities should attempt to include it into the RCs in, either an allocation method, if, we can one that aligns with the risk analysis that, is being done, or, using the portfolio approach that we talk about. And that's kind of covered in the next point here. I think PG&E, we've been doing a lot of work on this foundational stuff. Our RAMP experience in the RAMP that directly to how we think about these foundational items, right? So we do have the benefit of all the experience that we've done, and I mean I do have to say to Edison's and San Diego's point of view, the ramps are very complicated showings. We think we've got the basis all covered, but things might come up at the last minute. And so, for example, if we do find a good way of allocating costs, something that we can track, something that's actually we have SAP systems to support it, and so on and so forth, then yeah, we should allocate the cost. Most of the time we don't. So that's why we're proposing in our proposal, if there's a good way of allocating costs, by all means, we should do that. And it's something that's actually reflective of how these foundational costs are tracked, then yes, we should do that. But most of the time, once again, we don't have that. So we want to be able to fall back to this portfolio approach. I think that's the essence of what we're saying here. So if the cost, another thing about our proposal here is if the costs do exceed the established thresholds, the IOU should provide an explanation for how the foundational cost is included or excluded from RC calculations. So we will describe, if we're doing allocation, why we decide that this allocation is the best way to go, and how we can support that. If we're doing the portfolio approach, we will provide a tool for us to be able to look at the different combinations. So, and that's our last point there, that we fully support the parties' right to be able to delve deeply and explore these RSEs and how foundational programs can affect these RSEs. And Dr. Mitchell already provided a good suggestion in terms of thinking about these RSEs, and to the extent that we can, we'll definitely facilitate helping the parties to use the information that we have to do the exploration that they need to do. So that kind of sums it up. Is it time to open it up to general questions, Shayla?
Yeah, thank you, Vincent. I thought it might be best first to hear Cal Advocate's presentation and proposal and then open it up to general discussion. So we went over a bit. So Chris, we're going to tack on an extra 7 minutes to your presentation. So you have until 10:37. So Brevin, could you please pull up Chris's presentation? Thank you. And Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you, Shayla. Good morning, everyone. Rather than our presentation, and why don't we just, well, before we move on to the next slide, I think that you'll see that the focus of our presentation is on safety management systems as foundational programs. And so if we can go on to the next slide. So this language is taken from the staff proposal and foundational elements discussion. And this was a summary that was provided in terms of all of the different aspects of foundational elements. I'm not going to go through them here, but I'll just move on to the next slide. So in response to the presentation that the utilities provided and had sent ahead of time, what we did is we just drafted some specific recommendations on specific aspects of foundational programs. So we're not addressing details about thresholds or that sort of thing. This is to focus on really what should be included as a foundational program. And so our recommendation is that safety management system programs, which are often cross-cutting, that affect multiple risks, should explicitly be included as some of the elements that will be included in foundational programs and activities. And so we actually suggest making that clear and making that explicit by making a modification to the definition of foundational programs as it is currently being drafted. And the main thing is that safety management system programs can fill in some areas that are not currently being addressed explicitly, and they cross-cut across multiple risks often. So, just like I think there's been discussion and the utilities provided examples of what each of the utilities are using for foundational programs, these safety management system programs kind of fit into that bucket to some extent because they also cross-cut against mitigating multiple risks. This would then kind of raise the focus of foundational programs to include these safety management system programs. So we recommend a specific modification to the definition. We change it from do not directly reduce the consequences to may not directly reduce the consequences, because that gets a little more granular, in which case there could be arguments to suggest that a mitigation program is so broad, a safety management system program is so broad that it would be very, very difficult to tie it to direct risk reduction. However, there are probably some safety management system programs where you can divide it up and you could perhaps develop an RSE in terms of a very specific program. So ideally, it would not be something that has a very rigid structure that says, oh no, we're not going to report on an RSE for this particular program. And so that's basically what this slide addresses. And so in addition to the list of foundational programs that the utilities already kind of shared in their earlier emailings, this would ask that we explicitly ask utilities to include safety management system programs. And right now, I think a lot of utilities do already have safety management system programs to some extent. And later I'll reference an en banc that was here at the commission where all the utilities executive management came before commissioners and described what they were doing in that regard. So this makes sense that this also be included as part of the risk-based framework. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So right now, the utilities are doing some of this, and I think at an earlier TWG meeting when the utility said, oh, you can find some of this in the application, in the ramp. And so there is some that is being done now, but utilities may be taking different approaches to this. So our recommendation is that what's being done now should be useful and reported. And then in a phase 2, this could be further refined so right now it wouldn't be to be too rigid on what this would be, but for now we could all learn and benefit from how utilities are approaching these programs in their own organizations. So initially they could use and report on their existing SMS programs and ones that they are currently developing or that they are proposing to develop. And then later that could be refined. And so to the extent that those risk reductions can be quantified, then those should be reported and included. That way, folks can then develop an understanding of the risk spend efficiency of those programs. And finally, in terms of threshold, it would be difficult, I would imagine at this point, to specify a threshold for a safety management system foundational program. So it would probably be best, in fact, it would be best to not set a threshold for any safety management system program. Right now, it would be useful to understand what they are, what's being used, and then to use that information, and then perhaps later, if there is a need to have a threshold, then a threshold could be discussed and defined. But at this point, it doesn't make sense to do it. So I want to just kind of, so this is broadly talking about safety management system programs. Now I wanted to talk about more specifics for folks who may not be as familiar with them. If we could move on to the next slide. And on to the next slide, please. So some of the references come here are from a en banc that the commission had, and maybe we can move on to the next slide. So back in 2018, and this for folks who have the PDF or the PowerPoint, you can click on this link, and there was a long day of discussion about safety management systems. The first part of the day had to do with experts from different organizations, including a former chair of the NTSB, a safety expert and safety culture expert from Canada's National Energy Board. There was another large organization that deals with safety management system for operators and also for training that was there. So there were actually a number of experts that presented there. So if you were to go to that link, you would see a lot of presentations about different parts of safety management systems. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is that safety management systems, standards, and programs have been adopted by regulators and operators in a number of industries. Some key examples are listed here in the aviation industry, in the offshore oil and gas, more recently in FTA. And so they have been used and have been adopted to improve safety. And if we can go on to the next slide, please. So there are a number of components that are typically part of a safety management system or a safety management system standard. Each standard may have a different suite of specific core elements. Here is just an example that you can often find in all of the different safety management system standards. So these have been used to improve safety and to prevent catastrophic events, and their development has been in response to catastrophic events. So in reducing risk and preventing catastrophic events, it makes sense that these programs be highlighted, and since a lot of them are cross-cutting, the place for them is in foundational programs, which is part of this discussion today. So this just gives you an overview of what they are. By putting in focus, these programs can be brought into the ramp proceedings and then further fed into the rate case proceedings for review and for authorization. And they have a big impact on safety. I won't get into the details of them, but this is just an example. But you can see that a lot of these elements here are often cross-cutting. Some of them can then be applied to specific risks, but a lot of times they're also broadly applied. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to reference the FAA, who has adopted a safety management system program. And if we can go on to the next slide, please. So often safety management systems are viewed in categories of pillars, they call them, and then they're broken down into the elements that were on the previous couple of slides. So as you can see, and we were going to try to play this short clip, a video clip. If you click on that link, it's like a 2-minute video. So I encourage anyone interested in this to please try and see if you could have time to go take a look at this two-minute clip. It's a 2-minute segment from a larger clip, but this kind of shows an FAA slide that talks about these 4 pillars of policy, safety risk management, safety assurance, and safety promotion. One of the things that I think comes out of this presentation is that safety risk management and safety assurance are 2 key pillars for a safety management system to improve safety and reduce the likelihood of catastrophic events. Our focus has been a lot on safety risk management. Safety assurance is another key component of programs that will mitigate risk in a utilities ramp and then later in its GRC programs. Can we go on to the next slide, please? This is another graphic from, and this is another 2-minute clip from a larger video clip that goes a little more into the details of safety assurance. So risk management is where we're focused, and rightfully so. However, this is actually the proceeding for risk-based decision-making process. And that's what this all leads to. If safety assurance is all about the decision-making process of adopting these programs. So safety assurance should be explicitly addressed in the RDF because it is well within scope, and also it's all of this is part of a foundational program. So we couldn't get the audio to come across, but if you watch it by clicking on the link, you'll be able to get like a quick overview of the safety assurance aspect of risk management. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so here are the same links, the full longer versions of them. But here's just some of the quotes from those videos, just to kind of give an overview of safety management systems. It just, I won't read through all of these, but it says safety management system is not a replacement for a safety system. It adds accountability. It does not require a new department. And it is an integrated system, in many ways a foundational system for what a utility can employ to prevent catastrophic events. Then there's a little bit more focus on safety assurance. So they talk about the safety risk assessment side, risk management side, and that how safety assurance is key to then evaluate the performance of that. So we're not just looking for, out of the outcome of this process, we're not just looking to say, okay, these are the risk management programs, these are the mitigation measures, but a key ingredient to that is monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of that. And a foundational program must include that to be able to evaluate that. And the utilities, by having this program in place, can then report that information and be able to explain, oh yes, this is achieving the results that we were after when we adopted it and when we analyzed it. So a key element here is to be able to evaluate the effectiveness and have that information brought forward in the ramps. And we've mentioned that in previous presentations that we've discussed, the importance of evaluating the effectiveness of programs. Another element of that you'll often see in a safety management system is investigation of incidents, auditing, whether it's done internally or by bringing in a third party. And interesting enough, a number of these standards and organizations that have applied them have also developed organizations that will come out and audit those programs, industry organizations that will come out and audit those programs. That provides important feedback because auditing organizations have often seen various organizations or operators in a particular industry or even across industries. And that way they can look for, oh, what's up with that? This is missing, or here's something, a safety gap or something that needs to be improved or a best practice. So having that as a program, as a foundational program with explicit reporting in the ramps and then later to feed into the general rate cases will drive those kind of improvements. So, and then finally, it mentions on here that together, SRM and safety risk management and safety assurance SA are tools to be used in decision making, which is what this rulemaking is all about. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Just to give a little highlight on the effectiveness of this program, of these programs. Let's see. I'm on. What's my time again? I'm sorry, Shayla. I have until 10:37.
Yes.
Okay. I've just snagged a couple of slides from the Safety Management System on box. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So across the Bay, Contra Costa County has adopted safety management system requirements. They've also adopted, as part of that, a safety culture requirement. In fact, I think they've been using that for some time, explicitly requiring that safety culture be assessed and reported, and so they have actually, well, this next slide then kind of shows what they've done is analyze their performance in accidents. And so in Contra Costa County, this is because Contra Costa County has a lot of refineries, and they've had some pretty notable incidents over the years. And so what they're doing is monitoring to see the effect of instituting these safety management system programs as requirements, which include safety culture, to actually have an outcome, desirable outcome of reducing incidents. The FAA has some graphs, I think, that talks about how they've moved to an organizational culture, starting with compliance, now moving into organizational requirements, and how that's reduced aviation accidents over a long period of time. Anyway, we're on to the last slide. So that's kind of it. Any questions on those items?
Yeah, this is Wendy Holmgad. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Wendy.
Can we go back to that slide? I think maybe slide 9 that you had like examples of SMS safety management system. I think it was previous. Wait, one more. No, another. No, back. There. This one. Thank you, slide 8. Yeah. So, are you thinking that when the utilities file their ramps, that they would actually kind of have individual foundational programs such as, investigation, root cause analysis, and risk management, that they would have it lumped together?
So the recommendation at this point is to not be too prescriptive, but to provide whatever level and detail the utilities can in this regard, and then to further define this in a phase 2 after we see what's coming in now. Well, I'm not saying as we see what's coming in now, but utilities have already developed a number of programs. Hang on just a second. I'm sorry. But to the extent that these can be explicitly defined, where they do have, like, a safety culture might be a very broad program, but I think it can be submitted as a program. Safety assurance, whatever can fit in there, I think would be useful. And so this is really to bring more focus to this and to start the process of defining it. It's not a prescriptive try to detail that out, because I think that would be a pretty large undertaking at this point in time.
Well, I appreciate that, Chris. And maybe what I will say is that I do think that the investigation root cause analysis specifically is critical enough that perhaps that you could consider, and others could consider, pulling that out and identifying that as a foundational program. I'm just, I mean, I guess we all can consider that. I'm just talking because I've thought a lot about this, and, Chris and I, we've talked a lot about this, over the years too. And I just think that particularly for wildfire ignitions in California, you know, we do need to be doing a lot more forensic analysis, root cause analysis, you know, and also really understanding, you know, what mitigation measures could, you know, help prevent, you know, ignitions, you know, better, perhaps even protection schemes, you know, that was another thing that was talked about, protection schemes, you know. I just feel like there's a lot more to be done. And I think this is a really important part of, I didn't realize it was part of safety management systems until you brought it up.
Yes, yes. Agree.
Chris, this is Vincent here, if I may just say a couple of things. I think it sounds to me like your concern is, you know, whether the safety management systems and all the subcomponents are adequately captured in our risk framework, right? Our risk quantification framework. You know, how the utilities implement the settlement agreement, and with that, you know, thinking about that concern, you know, your definition of, if you go back a slide, if you don't mind going back a couple slides, whoever's controlling the screen, if you could move back a couple slides. I'll keep going. Yeah, so your definition there gives me a kind of a little bit of a heartburn, because you know, as for PG&E, and I was just chatting with my colleagues and confirming that we did calculate RC scores for safety management systems in our filings. So, you know, which I think is actually better than you know, including them as foundational programs, right? So we actually you actually have a better outcome here, and for us to go down this route, I think, you know, it's not exactly. I don't think it meets what you want, your ultimate objective. So that's why we kind of feel that I think in our filings, all of our filings are IOU filings. You know, I think you should look at whether, you know, we have adequately captured it, and not take the and not go down this route of specifying that it should be considered foundational for the very purpose that, you know, we might actually have gone beyond and done, you know, RC calculations for it. So, you know, I guess it's kind of goes to one of our points, which is basically that all the parties have a right to challenge whether things are actually foundational or not, or challenge whether RSEs have been calculated for programs or not. And including this language here might actually lead to a worse outcome than what we had in our relevant GRC filings.
I hear you, Vincent. I guess the question I might have then is, to the extent that you have computed RSEs on component programs, that could still be included. I mean, this does not, in this definition, this is in this proposal here, it's not to exclude these from computing RSEs. The RSEs should be computed when there is a specific RSE that can be calculated, but it does give emphasis that safety management system programs are expected and that they are to be submitted. And so then it raises this to have an explicit box, I guess, for utilities to put their safety management system programs in if they're not already. That way, there'll be a comparison to see what utilities have in terms of their safety management system programs, their effectiveness, their RSEs, and that way, if there are gaps where they're missing, then they can then be highlighted because, okay, this one's not here. You know, what's going on here? So I hear what you're saying, but it would give explicit emphasis to have it as a foundational program, but not to exclude or stop the work that you're already doing, but just putting it in place here. But I hear what you're saying.
I feel like the two concepts are a little bit orthogonal to each other. I mean, you have your boxes already. When we calculated the RRC for SMS programs, that's that's the box, man. I mean, that's so couldn't ask for a better box. So, you know, and I feel I feel that the concepts are a little bit, you know, orthogonal. And I think you're well within your rights to ask, you know, which RSE, which foundational components are in that RSE, which are not. And for those specific components, as you mentioned, there are subcomponents to SME programs. Maybe some of those subcomponents are not captured adequately in somebody's filing, and you think about it more, maybe they are foundational. But just mandating it up front, I think, does it does more harm, because we will calculate you the RSEs, and we want to do it in the manner that best makes sense, right? So just mandating it up front, I think, doesn't get you the outcome that you want. That's my opinion. But so
okay. Thank you, Vincent and Chris. I just want to jump in because we are bleeding into general discussion. And I think this would be a good time to kind of talk about ways we could address the proposals in general discussion. So Chris and Vincent were kind of touching upon the topic that defining what activities could or should be included as foundational elements in the RDF. And in the and that was I think the main focus of Chris's proposal. In the joint utility proposal, there were a couple of other areas, such as establishing a cost threshold, if any, and the treatment of foundational or apportioning of foundational costs in the RDF. So what I'm thinking with the time we have left is to kind of separate it out and maybe spend about, since we already started the discussion on defining what activities could or should be included, just kind of start maybe with that and spend about maybe 15 more minutes on it, and then move on to establishing a cost threshold, if any, and then discussing the apportioning of foundational costs, and maybe about 20 minutes each for the other two. So we kind of stay on topic and focus, and this will be an opportunity for other technical working group members to respond and ask specific questions, because what we really want to get out of today is to inform us in the R20 or in phase 1 of the R20-07-013 proceeding. So does that sound like a good plan? And does anyone have any concerns or questions about it? And I don't want to kind of box us in on only having a certain amount of time for each of maybe those 3 categories. We'll just see how discussion flows, but I don't want us to focus in only on one and not be able to address the other portions of the proposal.
Can you repeat it, Shayla?
Yeah.
Can you repeat it? Sorry, it was hard to catch what your intent was again.
Okay, my intent is to, there's 3 main topics of the scope of the meeting today. It's defining what activities could or should be included as foundational elements in the RDF. The second topic is establishing a cost threshold, if any. And the third is the treatment or apportioning of foundational costs in the RDF. And so what I'm proposing is for our general discussion, to make sure that we hit all 3 topics, is to maybe set a soft time slot for each of those, because PG&E or the joint utility proposal addresses all 3, and Cal Advocate's proposal addresses the first one. Is that a little bit more clear?
Thank you, at least for me. Thank you.
Not hearing any objections. I think then we could probably continue on the 2 different proposals on what activities should or could be included. And I think Chris and Vincent left off on it. So if we want to further discuss that, if anyone has a different proposal or alternative to what the joint utilities propose or what Chris proposed, it would be a great time.
Shayla, I'll just add what I was saying earlier was that I think that the one sub part of the safety management system that Cal Advocates proposed, the investigation root cause analysis, is so critical that, you know, I don't know, perhaps, you know, pulling that out, we might want to all consider, and I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Chris Baker from SoCal Gas and SDG&E also supports Vince's view on on avoiding to refine the definition that we initially showcased in our joint presentation.
This is Chris Vias with Edison. I appreciate the discussion on safety management systems. SCE remains supportive of the definition of foundational as staff had originally drafted it.
This is Eric Wojcik of UCAN. I just want to agree that it should be a focus, safety management systems. I guess one other question came to me was, if there's some way to differentiate that, I would think that some parts of safety management systems might be foundational or sort of bigger operating system type of things. And maybe, so that maybe there's some lines between what PG&E talked about. Vincent, you brought up a concern that you thought sometimes the safety management system would be outside of foundational. And then of course, Chris is saying some of them may be, I think, truly foundational or more foundational in nature. So maybe there's a way to, sometimes that might be parsed, but I think it deserves a much greater focus. Thanks.
This is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities, and we did, in our June 29th comments, object to the definition of foundation as vague and ambiguous, just because from the last meeting there was so many different understandings, it seemed, of the term, even though the words of the definition itself, when you read them, it does make sense. It's just that it seems to be interpreted differently depending on the perspective. So that's why we also suggested that the foundational programs be explicitly set forth on a published list. And I understand the reason for wanting to keep each topic to be addressed separate, and so that we hit all the topics. But from our perspective, the foundational programs, the definition is directly related to the reason how it's going to be used. So what some of the utilities proposals for foundational elements or what they would consider foundational are really, really expensive. And we don't want that to get lost. We don't want really expensive programs in particular, or any programs, to avoid the RSE requirements. And so that's our main concern, is that it seems like the IOU's proposal is, the effect of it will be to have more foundational programs where you can't really see the actual cost of the foundational program itself. Thanks.
This is Katie for Turn. I tend to agree with Melinda in that I do think that there are enough differences between the different programs that are all being put underneath the umbrella of foundational that there's, I apologize, I have a 2-year-old playing hide and seek with himself in the room. I think that there's some value in going through and understanding the different programs that the utilities are considering to be foundational, and creating kind of a list and a way of understanding them. Because they're, you know, when I looked at the preliminary list provided by the provided in one of Shayla's earlier emails, there were some that seemed like they were fairly limited to just a few different mitigations and others that did seem more broad. And so it seems like we need to be making some differentiation between kind of the two different categories of foundational cost. Chuck or Jonathan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Chuck, seems to me that what Mason was saying is that foundational costs are broken up into at least two parts. There's a part of the foundational cost that can be attributed to risk reduction or allocated to risk reduction, and there's another part that apparently is not. But then what I thought Vincent was saying was that in the portfolio analysis, the entire cost of a foundational project would be part of the risk spend efficiency calculation. So the entire foundational cost would be justified implicitly. I think along the lines of this discussion that there needs to be further definition about what a foundational project is and what its role in risk reduction is. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Katie, that's what you were getting at.
Yes, it was. Yeah, yes, it was.
I'm sorry, Charles, I had a bit of a hard time hearing you.
Forgive me.
Yeah, sorry, it might be on my end as well, but it seems like maybe the volume's just a little low.
All right, is this better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, what I was saying, I was just following up on what Katie was saying. It just seemed to me that Mason and Vincent said two different things about foundational projects, or implicitly they did. Vincent's portfolio approach is to aimed at justifying implicitly the full cost of a foundational project. Mason is saying that a foundational project really has two parts. One part is associated with risk reduction and one part is not. If that's the case, then the foundational projects have to be defined along the lines that Katie was driving at, I think, which is to separate the risk reduction part from the non-risk reduction part. And then we have to decide how the computations will be done with respect to those costs, if indeed the foundational projects can be divided. However, what's distressing about that, or disturbing or odd about that, is that I was under the impression that the IOU proposal was trying to avoid any sort of arbitrary decomposition of either costs or risk reductions with respect to the foundational projects. So following up again on what Katie was saying, we need some further clarification about that.
Hey, Chuck, this is Steve Hain here from the SPD. Let me try to shed some light on the definition that was proposed by SPD. So one of the original items that was deleted from the wording but is still included in the implicit definition is foundational programs or activities are initiatives that enable. So the term support multiple mitigations is really meant to convey that it enables mitigation activities to proceed. In the absence of those foundational programs, those mitigation programs may not be able to proceed because they are not enabled by those foundational activities. I think that's the concept. And so foundational elements, foundational programs do not directly, and I stress this term, very important, they do not directly, it's a key concept in this definition, foundational elements do not directly reduce consequences or the likelihood of risk events. I think that should be made very clear. And so the concept of talking about RSEs for foundational programs is somewhat misleading because the crux of the proposal is not to calculate RSEs for foundational elements, but to take into account the embedded costs, the implied costs of the foundational elements as they relate to those risk mitigation activity proposals. And currently, they're not included in those calculations. That's why we're proposing this approach to consider those hidden costs.
And I think, Steve, this is Katie. I think what we're reacting to is that it seems like there's a difference between cars because people need cars to get around and do their work versus a weather station, which is helping. Yeah, I guess that goes back to my argument that I don't believe that a weather station is less necessarily foundational. I believe that you could assign it risk reduction. But I guess a better example would be cars that the linemen drive to get to the to a site of an incident versus computer stations. Computer stations are kind of many more steps removed than perhaps that car is.
Right. So, Katie and Dr. Feinstein, I mean, just some general thoughts about it. Thanks for the clarification, Katie. It goes back to in our opening comments, we had kind of addressed it as well, right? I mean, in our original threshold test and opening comments, we had suggested that if there are general, if there are cars or computers or buying laptops or things like that, that we would buy regardless of whether we used it for risk purposes. Those would not be would not be included in the RSEs because we would get those cars or whatever because it for general purpose reasons. So that was that. Thanks for bringing that up, and we had addressed that in our opening comments as well. And our suggestion was basically that for general purpose, they would not be included in the RSE calculations. The other point that Chuck pointed out is that something I hadn't thought about, but I think that our joint IOU proposal still is able to accommodate, which is basically that to the extent that we have foundational costs that can be separated out between being directly allocatable to a mitigation and parts of it that are not, then we should separate out and keep and allocate the cost that we can allocate. Suppose our SAP systems can track costs for certain items in the whole foundational programs, can track costs down to the mitigations. Then we allocate the portions that we can, and the portions that we can't, we would use a portfolio approach. But that kind of seems to me that it would be on a case-by-case basis and something that would be very different from one IOU to another IOU. So kind of mandating a list upfront, once again, I think it's a bit problematic because what might work for Edison might not work for us and vice versa. So, but at the same time, I feel that the parties have all the tools available to explore, dig a little deeper into exactly what these components are, what these cost items are, and challenge us on those things.
This is Chuck Feinstein again. Vincent, based on what you just said, I remain confused. I was under the impression that that the portfolio approach is there in order to implicitly justify foundational projects that you cannot assign specific risk reductions to. And based on what Steve Haynes said, it's agreed that foundational projects, by definition, only implicitly reduce risk. They don't reduce risk directly. But then you just said that if costs of a foundational project can be allocated to risk reduction, then you can perform an RSE calculation on the foundational project itself.
No,
that
no,
I do not
sorry.
understand.
No, I'm sorry. That's not what I meant. I meant basically, first of all, this is not our experience, right? So I'm kind of speaking in general terms here. For our case, the foundational elements, we cannot allocate the cost back to the mitigations programs. But I'm saying that, you know, if there is some general case that PG&E hasn't seen yet, but in general, if, you know, we have a foundational program whereby certain parts of the cost, speaking hypothetically again, certain parts of the cost can be allocated back to the mitigations, then the RSEs for those mitigations should include those allocated costs. You know, if we track it that way, then I don't see why not we couldn't do it that way. So, but in PG&E's experience today, you know, the foundational costs are generally not trackable down to each mitigation. And so I'm saying that, you know, in our joint IOU approach, once again, thinking a little bit on the spot here, but I think it's still consistent. How we would use our approach is basically to the extent that costs can be allocated, they should be allocated, and the parts that aren't allocatable would form would be you know, in the portfolio RSE. Once again, we haven't seen it in our experience at PG&E. We're mainly in the camp where our foundational costs are not allocatable.
May I respond to that, please? I just want clarification. So in your portfolio proposal, the cost of the foundational program is either the full cost or the cost of the foundational program that is allocated to the mitigations that it supports in the portfolio analysis. Is that what you're saying?
No, so what I'm saying is basically, let's say the foundational programs, let's keep an example simple in our head, right? We have a foundational program that, well, one foundational program, sometimes we can track, you know, 20% of those costs we can track down to each of the mitigations that it supports. You know, 10% here, 10% there, and in which case those numbers, that 10% should be included in the RSE of the mitigation itself, M1 or M2 in this example, and the other remaining 80% we can't track down, so we include it in the portfolio calculation. So it would modify the RSEs of the mitigations, and it will also modify the RSE of the portfolio approach. Once again, you know, we haven't seen this approach, but I don't think what Mason and I are saying are necessarily in conflict.
Yeah, we can disagree on that if you like. That's okay. I still need to see, I would need to see some further discussion and examples before I understand what you're driving at. You may recall that in some of the public discussions we've had, we were wondering about how many different portfolios you would have to compute in order to justify implicitly the cost of a foundational program. And I think that's part of what concerns me here, because every different portfolio might have a different allocated amount of cost of a foundational program, if indeed you could make that allocation. And I thought the intent of what you were saying was to avoid all those allocations before, because if I understood what you said in our last meeting, those allocations tend to be simply arbitrary. And you wanted to avoid that kind of arbitrary allocation.
We do want to avoid arbitrary allocations.
Gentlemen, this is Eric Wojcik, just real quick. I actually thought that this was a way to scale the safety-based program element that could be foundational, and to the extent we can connect that directly to the risk reduction increment if that occurs. I thought that was in part where I heard Vincent and Chris talking to each other.
So this is Mason. I'd like to make a comment here. Hearing what I've heard today, I think it would be useful to walk through examples. I think Chuck suggested it, maybe others. I'm sorry, Dr. Feinstein suggested it. And I think it would be good if we could do such a thing. I don't want to keep saying things are complex, so give us a break and let us do what we want, because that's not what we're saying at all. But things are very complex. There are foundational efforts that are built more for risk on purpose. Like we have a risk reason and we want to have mitigation in place and we need something to support it. Other times foundational are things that already exist and then we're just kind of tapping into them. And sometimes there's kind of a mix between the two. And to sort of generalize what a foundational program, it sounds like that's a kind of a stumbling block for all of us to truly understand what we're talking about for allocations. So I don't know how much what's left on the docket for the scheduling, but I think that would be useful. And I know Katie would, I think she'd, maybe some of those would help to draw delineations between, is this foundational look different? Is it colored different than that foundational? And we could talk, like for example, the weather stations. Weather stations affect many different mitigations, and some of them are not even in the round. We use weather stations to help us understand photovoltaic measurements to look at marine layer and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff that weather stations do. And I think walking through some or many of them to have the broader audience understand how we think of them at the IOU, that like I think our message is, if we know that there is a dollar ask for those foundationals that it's going to go towards a mitigation, we want to allocate it and we want to include it in the RSE. But it's not as simple as just saying that and going about and doing your work. This is very complicated stuff. So yeah, I think examples would be very good. Thank you for the time.
This is Katie.
Sorry, Katie. One of our staff members just had a quick question. Arnold was wondering if PG&E or anyone else could actually do an exercise of the real life example using data.
Meaning here today, right now?
That was my question.
No, not right now. At a later.
Speaking for the other IUs, certainly we could come up with real world examples at some point. We can definitely look into that and share that back with you.
Okay, thank you. And sorry.
Could I raise a very maybe quick issue that might bear on some of these questions about fundamental and non-fundamental? That is, first off, one of the things that is an element that's important in any safety management system.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. Can't hear you.
Really? Oh, is this better?
Someone has
to get people to mute. Yeah.
Someone has both the phone and computer WebEx on at the same time, and it's causing a lot of feedback and echo. So could you please mute one of them, please? Now we're not hearing Paul Showman. Hey, Paul, we're not hearing from you if you're talking.
Paul shows up as muted right now, Steve.
Okay, maybe while Paul sorts out his audio, Katie, did you have something you wanted to say? I know I started speaking when you were.
Hear me now. Can anybody hear me?
You still have quite an echo, Paul.
Yeah. There's an echo or something.
Oh, you're better now.
Does this help?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay. Let me quickly. I wanted to say that it's in a lot of the literature, an emerging theme is that safety is more than just the addressing and mitigation of specified risks. It involves having a framework to identify risks that aren't yet specified and also to react to the events that do occur and be able to handle them more effectively by some anticipation of emergency response. In any case, I think the idea of this is that, to me, an element in safety management systems is safety indicators and safety management indicators. Just safety indicators often too often end up being lagging indicators. Safety management indicators can be leading indicators, and they can address a whole variety of safety issues, and they do have application to specific risk mitigations in the following sense. I do not believe that an effective and persuasive risk-spend efficiency calculation can occur without indicators of the competence and the existence of important elements of safety management. There will always be this kind of incompleteness, uncertainty to an RSE until an organization has developed persuasive and effective indicators, metrics of the safety management system that currently is in place in that organization. So that's all I wanted to say.
Oh no, am I still echoing?
No.
The point I was going to make earlier was I think that Mason's suggestion that we perhaps go somewhat more detailed in looking at and defining foundational programs is a good one. That was sort of the point I was attempting to make in comments on the staff report. I think as I've looked at the lists that were attached to Shayla's email earlier, I think there would be benefit to discussing some of these different programs and perhaps identifying whether there is a difference in treatment based on the type of foundational program, perhaps. I don't want to commit myself to that being the case, but I do think that it is an exercise that is probably worthwhile spending additional time on rather than doing something that is semi-arbitrary. Thanks.
This is Chris with Cal Advocates. I would agree, and to the extent that that can. Really quickly, could we move to slide 8, please, on this presentation? To the extent that a discussion of specific foundational programs can discuss safety management system elements, I think that would also be useful. So if there is further, if there are further meetings on this and further discussions on that, in general for foundational programs, I think that would be really useful. If it isn't accomplished before, if it cannot be accomplished, then we would recommend that it be explicitly included in phase 2. But to the extent it can be fleshed out more as before something comes out of this earlier decision, I think that we would welcome that opportunity. And just to highlight some of the things that are on here, there is the investigation, root cause analysis, operational controls. For example, there's been incidents where there was not a good program, I think, for location and mark and location. Safety assurance, quality assurance, understanding that the work is getting done, maintenance is getting performed when in times it's been determined that maintenance wasn't getting done or vegetation management getting done. I think these are all core critical elements that should be explicitly required by the commission. And I think that then it will then improve safety, making sure that these are all covered, that there are no gaps. So to the extent that that can be further discussed in a future meeting, I think that would be extremely valuable.
Thank you, Chris. So what I'm hearing is that after kind of discussing what activities should be included from Katie and Mason, it seems like there would be a benefit of discussing the programs and if there's different treatment depending on the foundational program. And I think Chris agreed with that. Maybe we could, as Arnold asked, or I asked on behalf of Arnold earlier, we could further this discussion by getting some real life examples with data. But and this conversation too kind of bled into apportioning. But what I'm taking away from this is that the proposals that were put forth today, it seems like there needs to be more discussion. And in terms of any quick decisions in this upcoming phase of the proceeding, it would be a bit difficult. Is that correct?
Shayla, this is Mason again. I do stand behind the comment I made about wanting to talk about examples and educate on the complexity of the foundational world. I wasn't suggesting, however, that we would use those examples to come up with hard-lined definitions of like, this is one and this is not. It was more of a illustrative way to inform the complexity. If it comes out of that we want to make buckets or definitions from those discussions, I think we would support that. But I think the utilities do not support a very strict definition of like, if it's got the word safety in it, it's foundational. That's not what we're looking for. That's not what the examples I wanted to go towards. So I just wanted to be clear that I was meaning it from just understanding the situation, and hopefully that would develop the definitions of the types of things that would go into one treatment versus another, not necessarily specific, because I think it's true that each utility looks at things a little bit differently, and that's probably not going to change soon. So I hope you appreciate the nuance there.
Yes, thank you, Mason, for the clarification.
This is Katie. I was just going to say, I think that, I'm going to go a little bit into the threshold and the apportionment and these comments. But in general, I think that what today has demonstrated, and what I think Turn keeps bumping up against as we think through this problem, is that there's probably not a one-size-fits-all blanket rule that works for these types of programs. It's going to depend a bit on the particulars, and so that means it's better to consider those particulars before we create a one-size-fits-all solution. I think that Turn's primary and the most important aspect of all of this is that for the individual mitigations, if there is a foundational program that is required in order for that mitigation to be completed or, to work, then that foundational cost should be included in the mitigations cost, and that it shouldn't be separated out, which would artificially inflate the RSE of the mitigation. And so I think if we're going to assign, implicit risk reduction scores to the foundational projects to justify them, I think we need to make sure that we are doing it in the most proper way possible. And that may the proper way may depend a little bit on the information that you have regarding that specific foundational program. And I think the other thing that I would highlight is that, and I'm pretty sure I was a person that identified that we should have cost thresholds multiple meetings ago, but I think I kind of would step back off of that a little bit, because again, I just want to make sure that we are reflecting all costs that go into mitigations, not just cost over a certain amount, if that foundational cost is required in order to successfully complete the mitigation. So again, I don't know that I'm ready to discuss specific thresholds, because it may be, as we look more closely at the foundational programs, that there isn't one single threshold that works.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Katie. I appreciate you bringing in kind of another part that I was hoping we could discuss in the general discussion about cost thresholds. Since we talked about what activities could be included in apportioning, does anyone have any comments like Katie on the proposal regarding the cost threshold and for including foundational mitigations in the RSE calculations?
Hey,
No,
Shayla.
sorry.
This is Steve here. I just want to inject one clarification point in the staff proposed definition of what a foundational element is. It states that a foundational activity is one that supports, keyword here, multiple mitigation activities. And that's why it is important to stress this keyword is that if a foundational activity did not support multiple mitigations, you would just roll everything into that single mitigation, and we wouldn't have this discussion here today. So the problem is that we don't know how to allocate the costs to multiple mitigations. So that's why the keyword is the multiple mitigation. I just want to make that clarification. Thank you.
And Steve, I hope I didn't mean to suggest that foundational didn't support multiple mitigations. I think that our proposal is somewhat that a portfolio approach that includes all of the different potential combinations is the most helpful data point, because that helps you identify the impact of perhaps deciding not to do a single one of the multiple mitigations that the foundational program supports, because that's going to impact, you know, the implicit justification that you've assigned to the foundational program. So understanding the impact of different combinations of programs is important.
This is Vincent here. I just wanted to share Mason's concerns about, you know, if we do decide to do any exercises into looking into these things in detail. I do think that there's differences in how utilities, you know, look at these foundational in terms of cost, for example. And I think even with the definition that we have, it doesn't preclude any of the parties or anybody from in the RAND filing and the GRC filing to further explore whether this treatment that we were suggesting it was correctly applied to the foundational element in question. And so going down examples might be helpful, but I think the way it stands, it will always end up being case by case. And so I'm just concerned that if we do decide to do these kind of exercises, we have a clear goal about that what we want to try and accomplish. And I don't think what we want to accomplish is to go through everybody's list of programs right now and determine how they should be treated. So there's that dynamic that we have to be mindful of.
This is
Melinda.
Chris. Oh, go ahead, Melinda.
Oh, thanks, Chris. I was just going to, Melinda for Protect Our Communities, and I just wanted to agree with what Katie was suggesting, that it would be beneficial to have further discussion before really getting into this particular issue. Our position, of course, is that there should be no threshold that, except with respect to truly de minimis costs. But I did want to comment on an additional concern with the utilities proposal. When they start getting into the aggregating in order to determine thresholds, I think that takes us even one step further away from having a transparent process. I think it's going the exact opposite direction in the threshold discussion. So I just wanted to point that out. But I do think it would be beneficial as Katie and Mason and others have suggested, to have further discussions with examples before, talking this through entirely. Thanks.
Sorry, a couple of thoughts, additional thoughts on my end. We do support thresholds. I think that thresholds help focus all of us, parties, the commission, even ourselves, on the items that are going to have the biggest impact, right? And as far as aggregating the programs together, threshold, I actually think that's a tougher test, because if you don't aggregate the programs together, you could have 5 programs that are under the threshold. But if you add all 5 programs together, they might actually come to be a substantial cost. So aggregating to a threshold, I think, is actually a tougher test to consider. And I think it's actually simpler but tougher test to consider.
This is Chris from Cal Advocates. So we would support what PCF in turn were saying about perhaps not having a threshold, because that does make things complicated in some ways. Just looking at the utility submission, for example, PG&E has a list of foundational activities. They do show, for example, root cause analysis. 2023 expense is looks like 2.8 million. I can't see if I'm reading across the right line. They also show risk analysis, inspections. So it sounds, it would be complicated to kind of select thresholds in terms of what's being aggregated or what's not being aggregated. And then these safety management system programs that some of them, I guess, are in the utility proposal, some are not, but to be able to put dollar figures on these and then decide what the thresholds are would be, I believe, difficult. So to the extent that these programs can be listed and then provided with their RSEs, to the extent that they do have direct RSEs, or if they're not, so that they could be considered as allocated towards different programs. So I did want to just first mention, not having thresholds or very minimal thresholds, I believe has a lot of value. And then in terms of the allocation, if I think folks have mentioned, well, it depends upon whether you allocate it this way or that way. It would be valuable to have those scenarios explained, So for example, and I don't know that it would be that difficult. I mean, I think, Vincent, you were mentioning you could then use a tool to reallocate it different ways that you would, I don't know if you would work with interveners to do it, or if interveners would use that tool. But if it were shown that it was allocated in one way, this is what you get with the RSE for this program. If you allocate it in a more direct way or a different way, you get this RSE. And then we could be able to compare how those RSEs, what those RSEs are, and then be able to see, okay, does this make sense? So those would be thoughts about the threshold, and also with the allocation questions that I think were being discussed.
Chris, just to clarify, the tool that we're proposing, in our approach, we're not allocating anything, right? We're just calculating these portfolio RSEs, which are basically roll-up RSEs, if you want to think of it. So, the different kinds of roll-ups, if you may, depending on which programs you decide to leave out and say you don't want to do. And you might have a different combination of programs that you want to do and not want to do. For in our example earlier on, there were 3 programs. We decided that in our filing we want to do all these 3 programs, and they require these 2 foundational items that to be done first. And you can always ask the question: what if you decide to do only 2 of these programs? And what would the RSE look like for your portfolio? And so on and so forth, right? So the example of 3, maybe it's not as expansive as other examples, but basically we're just testing different combinations of portfolios which don't require any allocation at all. I just wanted to stress that.
Does anyone have any further comments or questions to discuss right now?
Yeah, this is Wendy. I'm wondering, just a clarifying question. Are controls considered mitigations when we're talking about these things? I wasn't involved in the staff report, so I just wanted to ask that clarifying question.
Yeah, I think we're using the small m for PG&E.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify. And the other question I had, I guess I'm wondering if was I understanding, I can't remember who said it, that maybe some foundational programs, do things more than just risk reduction. So you would perhaps want to have like only a percentage of the cost of the foundational program assigned to risk reduction. Did I hear that earlier?
Wendy, this is Eric Wojcik. I think that's something I said or I indicated might be that we would be allocating portions of costs in a safety management system. It seems to me that some part of it is sort of a control for a whole bunch of things. Other parts of it are much more safety or dedicated to some safety elements. I'm not sure exactly how we'd take that apart, but maybe that would be something we would do. And it sounds like some of the other discussion, Katie, you mentioned would go along those lines. I think, if that's helpful.
It's just making me think about traditional cost benefit analysis, the discussion, because risk reduction is a huge benefit, right, for cost, and any cost, just traditional cost benefit analysis. But there are other benefits, and it's starting to just make me think, if we're getting into, where there will be programs that do things more than just risk reduction, and then how do you address those programs in the risk reduction scores and RSCs and stuff. I just was thinking about that.
Wendy, this is Mason. I think some of that will come out in the example talk that we're discussing, because maybe some of the examples would be something that you're hitting at right now.
Thank you, Wendy. Does anyone else have any more comments, questions, or remarks they would like to make?
Sheila, this is Chris Vias with Edison. Just a general comment, just a clarifying comment is, I think during some of the discussion, and very good discussion it was, people were at times it seemed sort of cross-referencing the PG&E proposal and then the joint IOU proposal. And I would just note that the joint IOU's proposal is what's contained in the document, both in the slides that were presented, but also in the written document that Sheila circulated when she circulated the slide deck. So they are two different things. PG&E has a proposal and joins with the joint IOUs in the joint proposal as set forth in that, but they are two different documents. Thanks.
Okay, not hearing anyone chime in before we wrap up. Does anyone from SPD have any last remarks or questions they would like to say?
Can I
Sure.
ask
I have
a
a
question
question.
unrelated to?
Oh, actually, I have a question for Katie and Melinda. So you two were strong proponents of requiring a list, an explicit list of foundational elements. Did you intend it to be to act as a limiting list, or what I meant by that is, can a utility later on, after the list has been established, and they later on propose a new activity and call it a foundational activity based on what you understand it?
Okay, so speaking as me for turn, of course, I mean, there's going to be new activities, and I don't think that we can ever say that this is the last word on something. I think that my suggestion that we create a comprehensive list of the different foundational activities is not to be dictatorial about anything necessarily, but to better understand the world of foundational activities and how they're being considered, so that we can create the best solution for how we handle them. Because it strikes me as we've gone through these conversations that they're not all, necessarily the same, and one solution isn't going to work for all of them.
And this is Melinda from Protect Our Communities, and I agree with what Katie just said. We certainly wouldn't be suggesting that we should, freeze ourselves in time on any topic, but I guess I do wonder. I do think it's the more forward-looking that we look, the more important it is to be assessing the costs of additional programs. So I do think that the link between foundational, what is foundational, and how we're going to treat foundational in terms of the RSEs, the conversation is inextricably linked in my mind, because I do think that, especially for new programs, it's going to be very important to have RSEs. So depending on how that conversation ends up, I think it'll affect how I see the list in terms of what should be on it and what should be added and that sort of thing. But we certainly weren't suggesting, any kind of permanence. It's all, we understand there's always room for improvement and changes and that sort of thing. So thanks for the question.
I want to have make a few clarifying remarks, not closing remarks, but clarifying remarks, to make sure that we are all on the same page on the SPD proposal. The first one is, as I've stated before, the emphasis on multiple mitigations. And the reason for having that word, that term, multiple mitigations in the definition is, in the absence, if we didn't have that, if it just addresses one mitigation, you would include the cost of that foundational program into the mitigation costs, and the story would be over. We wouldn't have this dispute now. So that's why the term multiple is very key to the definition. Second thing is the foundational elements concept in the staff proposal. The emphasis of that is on forward-looking costs and not on sunk costs. So that goes back to what Mason talked about on the weather stations. If a weather station has already been built, that's a sunk cost. That's irrelevant to the proposed mitigations and to the foundation elements project. So we're looking at incremental prospective costs, and it's not a retroactive look to costs that has already been incurred. And those are the two clarifying points I wanted to make. Okay.
Steve, I appreciate the feedback, especially on number 2. I think that's how we were hoping everybody was thinking about it, but you know, throw a little monkey wrench in there. There's a lot of maintenance costs on weather stations, so it's not all sunk. In fact, the maintenance is pretty significant. So you know, everything there's case by case comes up all the time. And I think that's why these examples of walking through what is meant will be really, really important. And I think maybe, Steve, something to think about is what I was mentioning earlier is maybe you thought this way when you said perspective, but if there's an existing system and it's performing some function, and we've identified we can use that to help risk scores. It sounds like you're saying if there's no extra cost, then it's not really foundational at that point.
I would argue against that position because those would then be O&M costs. They're not mitigation costs, right?
Our mitigation costs are capital and O&M in the ramp.
Okay, that's something to think about. Good.
Yeah, I'm glad. I think I like the way you're thinking about it, though. That's, yeah. We need to dive into those kind of thoughts a little bit deeper.
Yeah, that's the purpose of these discussions, is to ferret out all those nauseating details, to drill down on the details so that we don't leave anything hanging unanswered. Very good.
Thanks.
I don't have any. Yeah, I don't have any additional remarks, Shayla.
Thank you, Steve. I believe Wendy may have wanted to ask a question right before you. Let me just double check with her.
I don't think so, unless I forgot it. Maybe you heard me.
Katie. I had a non-foundational project SMAP 2 question. And that was mostly, are there going to be additional working groups on the PSPS piece?
I think at this time, we're still in the planning process for the PSPS technical working group. So we don't have an answer for you right now, but in the future, we'll definitely communicate probably via email when the next one will be.
Great. I was mostly just trying to make sure that I hadn't missed an email.
No problem. Okay, with that, thank you everyone for all of your input you provided to us today, and thank you for everyone who presented a proposal on this topic. Our next steps for it would be we're requesting informal feedback from this technical working group meeting, and informal feedback will be due August 4th. And you could email me, and I'll pop my email in the chat in case you don't have it, and we're requesting that you CC our RASA email as well. With that, I believe.
Sorry, this is Melinda from Protect Our Communities. Can I ask that we have until that next week? I would not be able to submit comments by the 4th, but the 10th would work.
I would support Melinda in that. This is Katie.
Okay, thank you, Katie and Melinda. I think as of right now, because what the focus of this technical working group would be in the feedback we get would be planning for phase 1, track 1, and that's looking at the scoping memo timeline. That's really cutting it close. So let me let SPD reconvene and discuss the timeline, and we'll send a follow-up email by the end of today, confirming the deadline, which we would like informal written comment or informal written feedback by.
Thank you.
Okay, well, unless anyone has any other questions, I hope everyone has a great day. And Chris, did you have a question?
Yep, just want to say thank you very much, Shayla, to you and the team. That's all.
Awesome, thank you. We appreciate all of the discussion and everyone's participation.
Yes, thanks very much, Shayla. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, and thank you to our IT team and Alicia for supporting this technical working group meeting. We